and I'm pleased to be here, glad to be able to share information about the CSDDD with everybody and to be joined by Ruben Zandvliet from Shift. So lest you all think that Jeff is particularly odd because he thinks about human rights due diligence every day. I mean, Ruben, I'm going to speak for you. I think probably the two of us also are part of that club. We think about HRDD almost every day. Even me on vacation, I'm thinking of HRDD. But I'm really happy that we're able to do this panel conversation, or just a conversation because it's just the two of us. But at the end of May was a really momentous moment in HRD, in the movement toward HRDD becoming the norm, which was the Council of the EU made its final approval to the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD. And this was the final step in a process that was started in February of 2022 and really just creates a uniform standard for responsible business conduct in the EU. So it is my pleasure to have Ruben here with us. He is the Deputy Director of Standards at Shift. Shift is a nonprofit organization that works across different stakeholder groups, so governments, multinational corporations, international CSOs, basically to translate the UN guiding principles on business and human rights into practice. So in his role, Ruben focuses on mandatory human rights due diligence and reporting regulations, and he supports Shift's wider engagements with companies in relation to regulatory developments and thematic work aimed at strengthening the S in ESG. Prior to joining Shift, Ruben was the business and human rights advisor at the Dutch bank ABN AMRO, and there he helped embed the UNGPs into the bank's corporate lending, project finance, retail banking, and investment activities. And finally, Ruben has a PhD from Leiden University, so we can also call him Dr. Zandvliet, where he examined in his PhD thesis the ways in which trade and investment law both enable and constrain international labor rights. So with that, I'm really pleased to have Ruben here with us. And I thought we could start by giving Ruben the floor because he truly has had a front row seat from start to finish for the CSDDD, and hopefully can give us a flavor for how that process went and what we have to look forward to. And I just want to add before I hand it over to Ruben, I would invite anyone who might have questions to put them in the Q&A box, because then we'll have some time for questions at the end of our presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Siv, and to the full FLA board for inviting me to speak about the CSDDD, which has indeed sort of dominated, well, not my full life, but at least the working part of it over the past 2 years. So Shift, as was mentioned in the introduction, sort of grew out of the process that led to the UN Guiding Principles. We were founded by the team that helped John Ruggie draft the UNGPs to work on implementation. And very often in that context, we've sort of heard the assumption that the UNGPs would be sort of a voluntary framework, or like intended to be and remain a voluntary framework. But that was a bit of a misunderstanding, right? The UNGPs do speak about a smart mix of national, international, voluntary, but also mandatory measures. So when I'm doing presentations, I very often start with a quote from John Ruggie, the author of the UNGPs, which illustrates very much that the UNGPs were not sort of the final text on business and human rights. Quite to the contrary, right? They're intended to create a new regulatory dynamic. And that's what we've seen happening, especially in the European Union over the past 5 years. So the UNGPs now really landed in the European Sustainability Reporting Framework to guide corporate sustainability reporting, but also in the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and that CSRD and CSDDD are really two sides of the same coin, right? One is about corporate conduct, one is about corporate reporting, but across sustainability impacts, and very much based on the same logic. And the the CSDDD in that way is both revolutionary, but also not so revolutionary, right? So it is not revolutionary because we already know these concepts, definitions, incentive structures, expectations from companies because they have been around for the past, what is it now, 13, 14 years, right? It is, at least the final text of the CSDDD is very much aligned substantively with the UNGPs and OECD guidelines. But at the same time, it is revolutionary because it adds an additional layer of accountability, right? There is no escape anymore for companies that do not take their responsibility to address sustainability impacts seriously. So the UNGPs and OECD guidelines were great to have a common framework around expectations for responsible business conduct. They've started practice within many companies, many industry multi-stakeholder initiatives with many countries, but they were not so good at reaching scale and reaching accountability. And that is really the layer that the CSDDD now adds. At the same time, there are some differences, right? So we've not just copy-pasted the UNGPs in the CSDDD. There are differences when it comes to scope. For example, the UNGPs in theory sort of apply to every company and takes into account proportionality depending on company size, etc. The CSDDD has a clear scope, right? So companies above 1,000 employees and 450 million euro annual turnover, they are in scope. Other companies are not. Perhaps at a later legislative cycle that may be changed. Then there are certain exemptions, especially around downstream impacts. So perhaps less relevant for many of the companies in the FLA membership. But a lot of downstream impacts that companies may be involved with, which is highly relevant, for example, in the tech sector, in the pharma sector, but also in the finance sector, they are carved out. That was sort of too contentious for policymakers to include. There were some misunderstandings about, like, is this the same as sort of upstream due diligence? How it is different? How would that affect competitiveness of companies? And in the end, it was decided to leave that part out for most downstream impacts. But still, when you then look at the content, so the due diligence steps, the expectations they're under, it's sometimes slightly different wording, sometimes a bit more detail, sometimes a bit less detail, but more or less the same as we are used to. So what we expect then from companies is to identify and prioritize the adverse environmental and human rights impacts that they are involved with. That prioritization works on a risk basis, using exactly the same logic as the UNGPs. So we prioritize the most severe and most likely impacts to people. Companies are then obviously expected to address those impacts, to come up with appropriate measures that prevent or mitigate impacts, and track whether those measures are actually working in practice. Communications is obviously sort of a key step in the due diligence process as well. There's just a cross-reference to the CSRD to provide that transparency framework. But then around sort of these last elements around grievance mechanisms and remedy, again, very close alignment with the UNGPs and OECD guidelines. There's a lot more to say also about administrative supervision and civil liability. Maybe we'll touch on that later on in the conversation. But just to sort of also flag what the role for industry initiatives and multi-stakeholder initiatives is, because that was a big issue during the negotiations, because some stakeholders wanted to see a safe harbor, right? So if you are a member of an industry or multi-stakeholder association, you're off the hook for civil liability. That was essentially the idea of the safe harbor. Luckily, that did not end up in the final text. There's sort of quite a nuanced framing around industry initiatives and MSIs. Right, they are recognized as important, recognize that they do not provide sort of a one-size-fits-all solution, that really companies are to assess whether the initiative is of sufficient quality and where in its due diligence process it adds value. The European Commission will also produce additional guidance on sort of fitness criteria, perhaps a bit in the same spirit as what the OECD is pursuing at the moment. But there's no sort of process foreseen at the European Commission whereby MSIs would have to like go through a very elaborate assessment to determine if they are indeed meeting all of those criteria. It will be guidance from the Commission, and then it's really up to companies to assess whether the industry initiative or MSI that they are part of meets those criteria. So maybe I'll just pause here, and then indeed we can enter into a bit of a conversation, because I'm also quite curious what FLA's views are on the CS3D.
Sif, you're muted.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure not to make any rustling in my papers while Ruben was speaking. So thanks, Ruben. That was a great overview, and really, I mean, I have to say this was a day that I wasn't sure was going to come, because that's at one point, you know, it did look like the future of the CSDDD hung in the balance, but it is, I think, truly possible to say that this is a revolutionary moment in business and human rights. And as someone who's been in this field for 15 plus years, maybe, this is it's quite exciting. And I think that, you know, we've gotten some questions in advance. And so, you know, I had billed this to Ruben as a fireside chat, although that doesn't really seem seasonally appropriate right now, but, you know, beachside conversation, how about that? So but I think the first big question that probably is front and center for a lot of at least our stakeholders, our business stakeholder group, is what's the best way for companies to prepare? You know, obviously they're the ones who immediately fall within the scope of the CSDDD, but, you know, perhaps there's a cascading effect, and, you know, it will be, you know, the ones who have to prepare because they have to report immediately. But I think there could potentially also be a cascading effect to smaller companies. But what would you say, and this was a question we had received in advance, you know, if a company is saying, what are the top 3 things I should do to prepare right now for, because the CSDDD will not take effect for another 2 years once because it's a directive, just to explain for everybody else, because it's a directive, each EU nation has to create implementing legislation, implementing the terms of the directive, but it's up to each individual country to do that.
Yeah, so how to start? I would say first and foremost, start early. I still very much recall the day when I was working at ABN AMRO, when the European Commission had just announced their sustainable finance agenda. And we had at the time a very sort of small sustainable finance team, and we proposed to the board to add 2 people to the team to try to make sense of this. But this request was obviously denied because this would only take effect in what would it be, like 2-3 years, and you know, we'll see when it comes. So just a bit further down the line, people in C-suite started to panic. We had to hire PwC for enormous amounts of money, and everybody regretted that we were not better prepared just a year earlier. So really start early and build capacity. I think on the substantive side of it, there is sometimes a bit of confusion around, okay, so we now have the CS3D, the CSRD, a forced labor regulation in Europe, forced labor bans in the US. We still have the UNGPs and OECD guidelines. Do they still apply? And if you like take your magnifying lens like try to make sense of every single line and spot issues where the terminology is not perfectly coherent. I would say that that is not the way to go. So make sure that whatever you do, the focus should still be on improving outcomes for people. That's sort of the core logic of the UNGPs and OECD guidelines. It is also the purpose of the CSDDD. So think holistically about implementation. When you think about what to do in the context of specific impacts, think about those impacts and your theory of change to address those impacts. Do not think about, or at least do not start with Article 11, paragraph 2, sub B, and contemplate on whether that provision forces you to do something that may actually not work. But we're trying to implement this provision, so that's where. So that's not to start really, and make sure that you maintain the focus on risk to people. Think holistically about your theory of change, about what actions will get you to outcomes, and that sets you up for compliance with those directives. And that is sort of the way to go. At least that's the way that we as Shift also on our business engagement side speak to companies.
That's great, Ruben. Thanks. And I think, not too dissimilar from how FLA approaches, a holistic system for social compliance. And, our mantra is a continuous sustainable improvement, and I think I always think of human rights due diligence as this sort of spiral going up. You're always getting feedback and incorporating that feedback and improving. There's always room for improvement. But I think you make a great point, is that, there is this alphabet soup out there, and sometimes it's like, oh my goodness, where do we start? And I think at the root of it is truly the human rights due diligence framework, because that is what's, like you said, that sets you up for success. If you take this holistic approach, learn your supply chain, what are the risks, identify the risks, see what you can do to mitigate, and then, again, back into that loop or the spiral of improvement. But taking a slightly different point of view, as FLA has 3 stakeholder groups. So there is, specific language in CSDDD focused on stakeholder engagement. So if you were a CSO, what would you say to them in terms of what steps should they be taking right now to be able to take advantage of that specific engagement? What would be a good way for them to focus on that?
Yeah, so maybe an answer in 2 parts. So the first part is that the legislative process is over, but the European Commission is still to produce quite a lot of guidance. So there's guidance on fitness criteria for MSIs that provides an opportunity for FLA to weigh in. But there's also additional guidance to be published around stakeholder engagement. So I think that's sort of the first opportunity to help further fine-tune the regulatory framework. We think that is necessary because although we are broadly quite happy with the level of alignment between the CSDDD and the UN Guiding Principles, the stakeholder engagement part is an area where we do have some questions and concerns. But also largely because this directive tries to combine environmental and human rights impacts, and the logic of affected stakeholders is slightly different. They've tried to sort of merge the 2 into one definition, and that's not ideal. But our hope is that the guidance process will provide an opportunity to further clarify stakeholder engagement in the context of human rights due diligence or labor standards, the role of trade unions, etc. The second part is obviously to read the text and figure out what the role of civil society organizations, stakeholders under the directive is. It is occasionally a bit more expensive than what the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD guidelines prescribe. So there's a bigger role, for example, in the context of disengagement from business partners. There are more specific, I would say, rights for stakeholders on information and sort of exchange with companies. On other steps of the due diligence process, actually the UN Guiding Principles are a bit more specific about the importance of stakeholder engagement. For example, when it comes to tracking the effectiveness of company actions. So there, the directive does mention stakeholders, but only when developing sort of indicators to measure effectiveness and not in, well, actually measuring effectiveness against those indicators. So make sense of it, and that's really the baseline to then develop your strategy.
Thank you. No, that's great. And I'll just quickly answer here whether FLA has taken a survey of the number of current members who would be required to participate in the CSDDD. I think we've informally checked, and it wouldn't be really a rather small handful, given the large coverage. So it's sorry, my computer's doing something strange here. Sorry. So that the 1,000 employees and 450 million euros covers, not that many of our companies, but some of them. So I'm hesitant to give an exact number because I want to say it's maybe five or six. But that said, I think the impact will be felt beyond those who are immediately affected by the CSDDD. And one of the, sorry, I'm sort of reading the questions, and I've done that one, sorry. I'm being selfish and asking my own questions for the most part. But I think that, so for our CSO stakeholders, I think, the message is really engage. I think the opportunity to be on the front lines in terms of developing guidance, I think will be extraordinarily important. It will be really interesting to see both the guidance that comes out, but also how the different countries establish the oversight entity within each of their legal systems for implementation of the CSDDD. I think, one of the things when you and I spoke earlier, Ruben, we were talking a little bit about, and you alluded to this with the references to the forced labor ban and the U.S. The U.S. ban on forced labor and the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. Do you foresee there's conflicting, or do you think these will be actually helping each other or potentially working against each other? And, we also have other mandatory human rights due diligence legislation in place in France and Germany. How do you see that interacting as each country starts to create its enabling legislation?
Yeah, so the answer is slightly different between national legislation and EU legislation. So France and Germany will need to adapt to the CSDDD. So anything in the French or the German law that is sort of at odds with the CSDDD in the sense that it is sort of less specific or provides less sort of far-reaching obligations, they should adjust to the CSDDD as a baseline. There is still some room to go beyond the terms of the CSDDD. Obviously, we're sort of aiming for a level playing field, no fragmentation, etc. But if member states desire to go beyond the level of protection, that is allowed. And there are some very concrete elements where it might also actually make sense for business to do that based on sort of German and French experience. But CSDDD will become the baseline. In relation to other EU legislation, that's obviously different. They will coexist. It was a difficult conversation because the forced labor regulation in the European Union and the CSDDD were moving targets. At the same time, they were being negotiated by different parts of the European Commission, by different committees within the European Parliament, by different experts within member states. So we worked quite hard also with civil society partners with the help of some industry initiatives. RBA, for example, has been quite active on both fronts to push sort of a coherent narrative. I think the final text of the forced labor regulation and CSDDD allow that coherent application. But we will also need to further develop that in the guidance. The FLR will also have its own guidance. And then sort of in the enforcement structure. But I think all of the ingredients are there. For example, for FLR compliance to consider the quality of due diligence, right? And not to ignore due diligence efforts and just say that like we've identified forced labor, so now you are in breach of the FLR. No, really take into account whether the company has any credible programs to address those cases of forced labor. And if that's the case, maybe not rush to import controls, but wait and see if the company indeed has an effective strategy to mitigate forced labor.
Right. No, that's great. A great point. I see our board member, Nazma Akhtar has a question. Nazma, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Thank you, Ruben, for your presentation and everything. I have question also the things that to say something also, because you're talking about the German and France law, but why you are not also talking about the Norway and also South Korea has also this act. So because when we go through this act, Norway act is much better than also other, and it is also I think we need to talk and issue and things, and also the issue or this act mainly it will not start it this year or next year or 26. It will be slowly. It will be implementing part will be that 27th to 2027, and German law must be implementing after 25 also. This is area also we need to understand and we need to do, because as a trade unionist and also worker representative, we are also try to make understand also our member and the workers and industrial global union. We are also working on it through OECD, you know, the UNGP guideline, and these are the many aspects. Originally, it's come from this area, and what is the value and things. This is the one issue, and the main thing how, because I am happy, and I don't know, because I'm not if it is really work for us, because in 27, 28, 29, this is the way things will be go, and how many the turnover, how many as a labor force, many aspect is going on. So I hope, because the American company, they're super big, they're super things, but they don't respect at all the labor rights issues, the legally binding trade union rights. So this might be how also work for all aspect. We need to also learn those things and how we can make them accountable. That is also more important for myself, because as an union activist, we need equally treated whole supply chain by our worker or rest of the world and different sector. So that kind of where is this kind of scope to work, and how we can make accountable more multinational rest of the world, Australian brand and other. I know it will be including, but America is a big country, big corporate, huge rich country, but very inequality system. They are adapting rest of the supply chain. So think about this kind of thing. At least those are the European country. They are adapting this kind of act, and many other countries will be sooner. So that also we need to be naming and shaming also the country as well as the company, because company has superpower. Whatever they want, it's happened to my country, and whatever American company was, that's also happened to this. I know the Biden administration is very proactive labor, but in reality, what is the change has been done. So it's a lot of issue, but we need equal treated and equal system, and the company must respect the union and freedom of association and collective bargaining. Thank you.
Thanks, Nazma. So there were a lot of questions or a lot of points there, but thank you very much, Nazma. I think, great to point out the Norwegian law, and, we were focused on the European Union countries in this, but there, that is obviously a strong law in Norway, and South Korea also has just passed theirs. But I think in terms of this, there will be the enabling period, the 2-year period that all the countries are putting in their legislation. But I think key here is the differences between the United States and the EU and its approach to human rights due diligence. And I think, I say, I know I'm being recorded, but dare I say, I think it's highly unlikely to see a mandatory human rights due diligence, at least at the federal level. I know there have been attempts at the state level in the US. That said, the forced labor, the Section 307 and the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act approach get to it in a different way, not by mandating the human rights due diligence, but to protect yourself against those acts. You actually need to do human rights due diligence. So it's a little bit sort of backwards, but maybe I'll stop since we're here to hear you, not me. Ruben, I'd love to hear sort of your thoughts on and Nazma obviously focused quite strongly on freedom of association and collective bargaining and respecting labor rights. So, what is the biggest, does the CSDDD have an opportunity to make a significant impact on international labor rights?
Yes, definitely. And I think, so I do not want to call US companies or the government naive necessarily, but there are sometimes, there's a bit of misunderstanding about the potential scope of the CSDDD. So it's obviously a European directive, but non-EU companies with sufficient commercial presence in the EU market are in scope. Once you are in scope, you are fully in scope. So there's no rationale that you would then only be in scope for your European activities. You're fully in scope. So if you're Amazon and you meet the threshold for turnover within the European Union, you're also in scope of whatever happens in your US factories. At least, like, there's no carve out in the CSDDD that would protect non-EU companies, protect, quote unquote, in that way, right? You're either in scope or you're not, and then you're in scope for the full sort of upstream part of your value chain for your own operations and for limited activities downstream. The point on Norway, South Korea, I fully hear you. I've been in many conversations with companies that, and especially, to be frank, the sort of business associations, not necessarily the sustainability focused ones, but sort of the industry, real industry representatives, who are very keen to get harmonization provisions into the directive, because they say, well, this is about level playing field, this is about avoiding fragmentation. So the directive should prevent EU member states to go beyond what we agree on in the directive. And I always found that a bit funny, because even if you succeed, you harmonize it between 27 member states. But what if there's a parliament-owned initiative bill in the United Kingdom? There's something in Norway, there's something, right? So you will not resolve fragmentation problems for companies by this harmonization clause in the CSDDD. The only way to achieve harmonization is to use the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines as the benchmarks, and not deviate, or not, at least not deviate in a problematic way, from the definitions, the due diligence logic, the incentives that are in those internationally agreed frameworks. So it's very much an international conversation, and for all countries that are sort of also contemplating mandatory due diligence in one form or another, we would really be keen to focus on the UNGPs and OECD guidelines there as the benchmarks, because that will help stakeholders, unions, but certainly also companies that are worried about fragmented expectations.
Yeah. Nancy, I see your hand, but I've had a question waiting in the Q&A box for a little bit, so I'll do that and then I'll turn to you. So the question in the Q&A box is, what are the implications of the removal of the safe harbor provision for MSIs like FLA, where membership might have given credit that had the provision advanced? So I don't know if you want to take that first, or I can sort of briefly talk about that. I think FLA was keen to have MSIs recognized as important partners in CSDDD and in mandatory human rights due diligence, but ultimately, I think we agree that the responsibility lies with the company itself. And I think that it was so I'm not sure immediately what our implications would be. I do think that we see ourselves as important and valuable partners, particularly guiding through this process with, as you heard, Ruben, celebrating 25 years, to a certain extent, our system predates this concept of human rights due diligence, but that's effectively what it is in the context of labor rights and global supply chains. So I don't know, it was an anonymous question, so I don't know if that answers the question, but Ruben, maybe I can invite you if you'd like to share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I haven't come across an MSI that was enthusiastic about the idea of a safe harbor, because it really puts the burden on MSIs. It would really imply like tremendous sort of upfront efforts to assess quality, and then what do you do if it turns out that it isn't so robust as you thought? So the line now is accountability is clearly on the company, but it is recognized that MSIs can really add value. There is additional guidance to be made, but again, it's on the company to assess whether their MSI meets that criteria. There's a provision also that the European Commission member states are encouraged to stimulate new industry initiatives in MSIs where they do not yet exist. And it will also be sort of within that dynamic of especially administrative supervision. I assume that also in that context, cases will emerge where companies will say, but wait a minute, I relied on my MSI and well, that's not sufficient. So also that piece of it, which will come even after the guidance, will be important also for MSIs to follow. Yeah,
no, exactly. I think that was even FLA submitted comments to the initial draft on CSDDD, and I think our comment was to also say, you need to have some criteria as to how do you define, a strong initiative to work with in this process. So, Nancy, did you want to ask your question?
Yes, if there's time, I would just be interested in your insight on what you think, considering where things stand now, what will be the most challenging parts for companies to adjust to, and the role that FLA may be able to offer, especially high value to companies from your perspective.
Thanks, Nancy.
Yes, so I would have, I could talk about this for an hour, of course, but maybe so what comes to mind first? The initial proposal that was presented by the European Commission sort of assumed that adverse impacts are they're caused by business partners at tier X in your supply chain. So the theory of change is that companies in scope should adjust their contracts and those contracts to their tier 1 suppliers. That should be cascaded down. You conduct an audit to verify if everything is okay. In the final version, there is a very strong paragraph that says that a company's own business strategy and purchasing practices are to be examined, right? You should start in-house. You should look at how you as a company conduct business, the terms that you impose on your agree with your suppliers, and really be frank about whether any of that can create difficulties down the line. So the business model red flags, as we like to call them at Shift, and we've done quite some work on that, are really front and center in the CS3D. And then there are a number of other areas where perhaps the CS3D goes beyond sort of our current understanding of the expectations in the UNGPs. For example, around grievance mechanisms. So the UNGPs talk about operational level complaints or grievance mechanisms. The CS3D talks about complaints mechanisms in a way that has no limitations to sort of operational level. It's perhaps to be figured out a bit more in guidance, but it seems to imply that stakeholders in your sort of full supply chain should be entitled to file complaints with the company in scope. And that's quite a different model of complaints mechanisms than what we are used to under the UNGPs and OECD guidelines.
Well, thanks, Ruben. I'll just add, thank you, first of all, Ruben, for mentioning responsible purchasing practices. I think it's, the opportunity for FLA is really to showcase what we've been doing, that FLA has always taken an approach that's not just top down, it's also bottom up. So it's looking at, headquarter level and factory level, and how do these two things interact with one another? It can't just all flow from one direction to the other. It has to be responsibility taken on both ends of the supply chain. So I think that for FLA was gratifying to see, because we, like I said, I feel like we can be a strong partner with companies as they work to implement the obligations of the CSDDD.